chapters in Leviticus.
They started their sacrifices.
Mm-hmm.
They made mistakes.
Uh-huh.
Last week, Aaron's sons offended God very drastically.
Mm-hmm.
They burnt incense in the chapel or in the temple, and he had a very harsh punishment for them. He killed them,
Mm-hmm.
and God gave Moses instructions to Aaron that he wasn't to mourn outwardly by carrying his clothes and that kind of thing. And the Levites were called in to take the bodies out
Mm-hmm.
because they're not priests. And the priests, if they had done it, it would have made them unclean.
Right. So all that instruction after the sons of Aaron die is to make sure that the priests who are left, and in particular the high priest,
Yeah.
he doesn't defile himself,
Mm-hmm.
that he doesn't desecrate the clothing that he's wearing, that he doesn't defile himself by touching anything unclean, because if he does, then what? Why does it matter if he...
And they couldn't sacrifice for the people.
That's right, yes. He's now the person who stands as the mediator for the whole nation. If the priests desecrate themselves, if they defile themselves, the nation loses their mediators. So it's a really big deal that now the priests, they really have to prioritize the well-being of the nation over whatever customs or rituals they would normally follow when it comes to mourning the death of someone. So Aaron does what he's told, and it's a very sobering warning right there to the priests, as well as to the people about who they're dealing with. It's not that God is just temperamental, it's that he's holy, and his holiness destroys impurity. And the people have to be mindful of that all the time when they come to worship him. That's not how they treat necessarily the false gods of the nations around them, but this is how the Lord has to be treated because he's the living God. And he wants fellowship with him, but he's dangerous. Okay, now, chapter 11 begins a new section in Leviticus, and it's not a change of subject so much as it's just the logical progression from chapters 9 and 10. So the Lord's now dwelling among his people because of this now inauguration of the tent of meeting. Now he's dwelling among his people, and one of the jobs of the priests, according to what we saw last week in chapter 10, is to distinguish between what's holy and what's common, what's clean and what's unclean, and to teach that to the people so they can approach a holy God. And we've just had this example of what happens when people approach God wrongly. So, following that defilement of the tabernacle by Aaron's sons, chapters 11 to 15 are now going to focus on all the various distinctions for ritual purity and impurity, for the very purpose of preventing that kind of thing again, preventing not just the priests but the people from defiling the Lord's dwelling place, even inadvertently. Now, it's not possible to prevent all the pollution of the Lord's dwelling place, which is why after we get all these chapters on ritual impurity, it's going to get capped off by the Day of Atonement in chapter 16, because that's the one day a year that's set aside to deal with all the accumulated pollution of the Lord's dwelling place. But the people are always to be mindful of their personal ritual state, of being ceremonially clean or unclean, because approaching a holy God when you're ritually unclean is dangerous. Okay, so chapter 11 is going to start with the most fundamental category of things, external things, that make you ritually clean or not. This is a category you have to deal with every single day, multiple times a day, and that is what you eat. So the food the Israelites consume has a direct effect on their ritual state, so they have to always be mindful of what they're putting in their mouths. Now, before we read this chapter, let's just talk for a minute about the laws. So let me give you a couple of scenarios. So when I was a student, I had a classmate who was from Finland. and several years after we were out of school and she'd gone back home, she had friended me on Facebook, and she and her husband were celebrating their anniversary. So they went out to eat at this really fancy restaurant, and she had taken a picture of her plate and posted it because it, you know, the food was really nice and fancy and everything. So she posted anniversary dinner at this fancy restaurant, and then she put underneath it, the horse was amazing.
Oh,
Was amazing.
Oh, amazing.
Oh.
And I remember reading that like 3 times and thinking, wait, she went to a fancy restaurant and she ate horse steak. Yep, that's exactly what she had.
Oh, my word.
Turns out, it's not that unusual in Finland or in other places in Europe to eat horse, right?
My
Yes.
mom's eating it in Switzerland.
Yes.
What?
Mhm.
Was it
And then
good?
you don't tell people when you get home, right?
I didn't eat it, but yeah, they have it in Switzerland.
Yeah. Okay, so there's one scenario. Another thing, several months ago, I was reading this article on the internet where there was a situation that happened in New Zealand because there were these Africans who had immigrated to New Zealand from Cameroon. So they settled into some neighborhood in the city in New Zealand, and you know, and everything seems normal. Then they get a dog, and after they'd had the dog for a while, one day they ate it. And their neighbors figured out that they had eaten their own dog, and when they realized that they had eaten their dog, they got really upset. So they called like the New Zealand equivalent of the SPCA or whatever and turned them in, and then the police came, and they ended up taking them to court. And when they got to court, the judge was like, you can eat your dog. Like there's actually no difference between eating your dog and eating your chicken,
Yeah.
as long as you just aren't cruel about the way that you kill it. You can't torture the dog, but you can eat the dog. And all these people were really upset. That's not, you shouldn't be able to eat your dog. But now, we could keep going, but here's the point. Everybody follows dietary rules. Everybody. Every culture has standards for what they consider edible or inedible, disgusting, delicious, healthy, unhealthy, high class, low class. And we don't think about those standards necessarily as dietary rules because they're not written down in black and white, and you won't usually go to court for breaking them. They're just unwritten rules that never get questioned unless you go to another culture, because everyone just assumes them. Who decided that horses are inedible?
God.
So, the thing is, these are things we take for granted, and the food norms differ between nations. They distinguish people groups from one another. They distinguish cultures from one another. They distinguish classes and subcultures from one another. You know, if you don't think they're actually rules, well, what do you think would happen if the Oxbow started serving horse steak?
I wouldn't eat it.
I think people would boycott it.
I think so too. Or
Yeah.
let's ratchet it up a bit. Let's say that they start going down to the animal shelter every weekend, taking the dogs and cats out
Yeah.
and using them to make a sandwich special every weekend. What do you think would happen? Would people just be like, you know, cat, I just don't think that's my thing?
No.
No.
They'd be outraged, wouldn't they?
I think
Well, this
that,
being
yeah.
Lander, there'd be a protest on Main Street.
Yeah.
I mean, people, it wouldn't just be like, that means it's not my cup of tea. It would be like, that's wrong,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Because we have dietary rules. Our culture has dietary rules. And there are certain things that we say, you don't eat that stuff, and it's not just because it's our preference, it's because people think that it's wrong. Now, those kinds of things are not burdensome for us if everybody in the culture is following the same rules, right? I mean, if you're vegetarian or you're vegan or you're gluten-free or you're lactose-free, then you have to pay attention to the menu where you go. You have to pay attention to what's being fed when you go to a potluck or to somebody's house. But you don't have to pay attention to whether or not you're going to get horse steak at a potluck at church, right?
Right.
No, because nobody eats horse.
Right.
So you don't even have to think about it. And it's not a burdensome kind of thing to be like, I can't eat horse, because nobody does it.
My daughter would disown me.
Yeah. Now think about that in relation to the Israelites. The dietary rules in Leviticus, I've often thought about them this way, and I think lots of people do. They're often considered controversial and burdensome, but that's mainly because they're not the same as ours. So what I mean is, if Leviticus said you can't eat mice, rats, lizards, skunks, hawks, eagles, crows, ravens, vultures, spiders, flies, wasps, worms, slugs, cats, dogs, coyotes, wolves, or horses, well then every American would be like, duh. Like, everybody knows that, right? Why do you have to have a list? Everybody just knows that. But a European would say, why not horses? And a Cameroonian would say, why not dogs? And a Chinese person would say, why is there a list at all, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the reason these rules get our attention is because our culture has different rules. But if everybody goes by the same rules, nobody thinks twice about it.
Because we haven't been hungry.
That too.
Yeah.
We have an overabundance of,
Yeah.
yes.
Or lost somewhere, and
That's all
maybe
there is.
hours before you're rescued, or
Mhm.
not at all, or it's, I don't know what I would resort to, but,
Yeah, but even in places where there's poverty, people still have standards for what's, you know,
Mhm.
yeah.
what you only eat if you have no choice. But this is one of the things that was interesting in Tanzania was that the tribes ate different things. And so there were certain things that certain tribes ate that other tribes wouldn't be caught dead eating. And, you know, there was this one tribe where everybody knew they used to eat cats. They don't anymore, but they did then, and so everyone's like, don't eat with those people. Like, so,
Don't eat Justin's tacos, he makes squirrel tacos.
squirrel, I don't like
I eat squirrel.
See, now we have a clash of dietary
Yeah.
rules.
And what did it taste like?
Chicken.
Of course. It's been a long time, just to say.
All right, now, that's just by way of introduction, but we'll talk more about then the particular purpose of the dietary laws in Leviticus. We'll come back to that at the end. So, let's look now at chapter 11. By the way, just before we read through this, let me just say, you might have a footnote about this in your Bible, but a lot of the words in this chapter, a lot of the terms that are used here are really obscure. There are some words where this is the only place in the Bible where they're used. So there are particular animals where the translators have made their best guess, but they're not certain what the word means. So if you look at different translations, you'll see different kinds of animals listed, and if your translation's different from mine, you're gonna see some things that are different, but that's why, is because the translation of some of these terms isn't quite
Like
certain.
the high rats?
Yeah.
Mhm.
All right, chapter 11. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, say to the Israelites, of all the animals that live on land, these are the ones you may eat. You may eat any animal that has a split hoof, completely divided, and that chews the cud. There are some that only chew the cud or only have a split hoof, but you must not eat them. The camel, though it chews the cud, does not have a split hoof. It is ceremonially unclean for you. The coney, though it chews the cud, does not have a split hoof. It is unclean for you. The rabbit, though it chews the cud, does not have a split hoof. It is unclean for you. And the pig, though it has a split hoof, completely divided, does not chew the cud. It is unclean for you. You must not eat their meat or touch their carcasses. They are unclean for you. Of all the creatures living in the water of the seas and the streams, you may eat any that have fins and scales. But all creatures in the seas or streams that do not have fins and scales, whether among all the swarming things or among all the other living creatures in the water, you are to detest. And since you are to detest them, you must not eat their meat, and you must detest their carcasses. Anything living in the water that does not have fins and scales is to be detestable to you. These are the birds you are to detest and not eat because they are detestable: the eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the red kite, any kind of black kite, any kind of raven, the horned owl, the screech owl, the gull, any kind of hawk, the little owl, the cormorant, the gray owl, the white owl, the desert owl, the osprey, the stork, any kind of heron, the hoopoe, and the bat. All flying insects that walk on all fours are to be detestable to you. There are, however, some winged creatures that walk on all fours that you may eat, those that have jointed legs for hopping on the ground. Of these you may eat any kind of locust, katydid, cricket, or grasshopper. But all other winged creatures that have 4 legs you are to detest. You will make yourselves unclean by these. Whoever touches their carcasses will be unclean till evening. Whoever picks up one of their carcasses must wash his clothes, and he will be unclean till evening. Every animal that has a split hoof, not completely divided, or that does not chew the cud is unclean for you. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them will be unclean. Of all the animals that walk on all fours, those that walk on their paws are unclean for you. Whoever touches their carcasses will be unclean till evening. Anyone who picks up their carcasses must wash his clothes, and he will be unclean till evening. They are unclean for you. Of the animals that move about on the ground, these are unclean for you: the weasel, the rat, any kind of great lizard, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the wall lizard, the skink, and the chameleon. Of all those that move along the ground, these are unclean for you. Whoever touches them when they are dead will become unclean till evening. When one of them dies and falls on something, that article, whatever its use, will be unclean, whether it is made of wood, cloth, hide, or sackcloth. Put it in water, it will be unclean till evening, and then it will be clean. If one of them falls into a clay pot, everything in it will be unclean, and you must break the pot. Any food that could be eaten but has water in it from such a pot is unclean, and any liquid that could be drunk from it is unclean. Anything that one of their carcasses falls on becomes unclean. An oven or cooking pot must be broken up. They are unclean, and you are to regard them as unclean. A spring, however, or a cistern for collecting water remains clean, but anyone who touches one of these carcasses is unclean. If a carcass falls on any seeds that are to be planted, they remain clean, but if water has been put on the seed and a carcass falls on it, it is unclean for you. If any animal that you are allowed to eat dies, anyone who touches the carcass will be unclean till evening. Anyone who eats some of the carcass must wash his clothes, and he will be unclean till evening. Anyone who picks up the carcass must wash his clothes, and he will be unclean till evening. Every creature that moves about on the ground is detestable. It is not to be eaten. You are not to eat any creature that moves about on the ground, whether it moves on its belly or walks on all fours or on many feet. It is detestable. Do not defile yourselves by any of these creatures. Do not make yourselves unclean by means of them, or be made unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. Do not make yourselves unclean by any creature that moves about on the ground. I am the Lord who brought you up out of Egypt to be your God. Therefore be holy, because I am holy. These are the regulations concerning animals, birds, every living creature that moves in the water, and every creature that moves about on the ground. You must distinguish between the clean and the unclean, between living creatures that may be eaten and those that may not be eaten. Okay.
Doesn't sound like there's much left for them to eat.
No.
All right.
Doesn't make me hungry.
That's chapter. I can easily pass on this.
Yeah.
All right, how does the chapter begin in verses 1 and 2? Well, first in verse 1.
Yahweh speaks.
Why does that matter? Where did the dietary laws come from? Did
The
people just
Lord.
decide one day, they were like, oh, I don't think we're going to eat this, we're going to eat that? No.
From God.
It comes from the Lord, and we're going to see this repeated over and over and over in the chapters that come, that all of these commands are the things that the Lord has commanded the people. Because again, he's not just asking them for suggestions about how they want to worship or how to be set apart for him. He's commanding them. He's telling them how to do it, because we know what happens when people are left to their own devices when it comes to worship. You end up with a golden calf in about 5 minutes. So everything that the Lord wants them to do, he's making it very clear. And so he's the one who gives the instructions to Moses and Aaron. And then the instructions, sometimes the instructions are just for the priests, but right here it's for all of Israel. So all of Israel needs to know these things that are coming next. So verses, well, let me just say the chapter can be divided in half. So verses 1 to 23 tell us which animals are clean or unclean. And then those verses can be further broken down into 3 categories. So land animals, that's up to verse 8. Water creatures, that's verses 9 to 12. And then flying creatures, that's 13 to 23. So that's the first half of the chapter. The second half of the chapter, verses 24 to 47, describes the pollution that's caused by unclean or dead animals and what to do about it. Okay, so we start off with land animals in verse 2. Now, what does he say about the land animals in verses 3 to 8?
In verse 8,
3 to 8.
3.
Parted hoofs and animals that chew their cud
Right,
we're allowed to eat.
yes.
They were allowed to eat.
Yeah. So that would include herd and flock animals, like cattle, sheep, and goats, but it would exclude things like camels, pigs, and horses. It would include some game animals like deer, but it would exclude wild animals like rabbits and hyraxes or coons, depending on your translation. And verse 8 says that the people must not eat the meat of the animals or touch their carcasses since they are unclean. Now, we'll see later, it is actually permissible to touch the carcass of an unclean animal. But I think the reason for the prohibition right here is to make the people aware. It's not just eating it, but even touching it makes them unclean. And uncleanness has to be dealt with properly. Okay, now, what does he say about, well, what's the next category? What does he say about them in verses 9 to 12?
Fish, water animals.
Mm-hmm.
No seashells, no shellfish.
Shellfish.
Right, so it's basically anything with fins and
And
scales,
scales.
right? That's what you can eat. So this includes fresh and saltwater creatures, whether they live in the sea or they live in lakes and streams. The Israelites were not a seafaring people. They tended to avoid the sea because they were afraid of it. But they would have known some of these things from their time living in Egypt, although I'm not sure that this is what they typically would have eaten. But yeah, the basic rule is it has to have fins and scales. Anything else is off limits.
Yay, we don't have to eat catfish.
Has that been a problem for you, Liz?
I hate catfish.
So no eels, mollusks, squid, shrimp, anything like that.
No problem.
No
shrimp?
No problem.
Oh,
That's
yeah,
right.
I like shrimp.
So just like with land animals, unclean marine animals, they're not to be eaten, and anyone who touches the carcass of them also becomes unclean. Okay, what's the third category in 13 to 23?
Birds.
Yep, anything that flies, and what does he say about them?
The eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the red kite, and kind of black kite are unclean. The raven, the horned owl, the screech owl, the gull, and any kind of hawk.
Now, it appears,
And it goes on.
Is that generally like birds of prey? Is
it
that-
seems like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not gonna go out on a limb about that because we don't know for sure what some of these words are, but it definitely seems like this list tends to include birds of prey and birds that are scavengers.
Because they're
Is
eating
this-
dead things.
That's right, which would already make them unclean.
Is the stork a scavenger? I didn't realize that they were.
And herons?
Well, herons eat fish,
Herons eat, yeah.
so anything that would
frogs.
eat fish would be in that category, but, yeah. So again, I'm not going out on a limb about this, but
Okay.
certainly it would seem that anything that eats other animals or dead things
So
would
they could
be
eat ducks.
on the list. It
It
sounds-
looks like.
Looks like
You
it
can
could.
eat ducks?
Yes,
Yeah.
Does that make you feel better?
And pheasants.
Pheasants, yeah, pheasants, yeah.
All right, now, that's the birds, and then verses 20 to 23 list off all the insects that are unclean and therefore not to be eaten. And I know you're disappointed that some of them can't be eaten, but anyway. So any insect that walks on all fours and also has jointed legs for hopping can be eaten, like locusts, grasshoppers, crickets.
I have bad news, sorry, I have to interrupt.
Mm-hmm.
Chet was out yesterday, and we were looking at all the plants coming up, and he found a grasshopper.
Oh, no, not already.
A live one.
Oh, my God.
Did he eat it?
No. He wanted to smash it, but it was too fast.
Oh.
So what happens if you step on a bug? Are you unclean?
Well.
Or do you just have to put your shoe in there?
Well, that's what I would say, is I would say if you were in your shoe, it's just your shoe's unclean. You probably want to wash the bug off your shoe anyway.
If you even noticed that
I
you
know
did
it.
it.
I didn't notice,
Mhm.
And when it says walking on all fours, that's just a figurative way of referring to insects that walk in contrast to birds. And by tradition, the two big legs on grasshoppers and locusts were not counted as part of the four. So they're considered a different
Oh,
type of
yeah.
legs.
So that's why they were okay to eat.
Yeah, so if you, they're called leaping legs. So grasshoppers had leaping legs above their walking legs. That's what makes them edible, is any kind of insect that has those kinds of jumpy
Oh, that's
legs.
interesting.
Yeah. Mhm. And then all other flying insects are considered unclean. Now, why not list the other insects, non-flying insects, or those with 6 or 8 legs? I would guess it's because it wasn't on anybody's radar to eat them. Like spiders, scorpions, flies, wasps, centipedes, stink bugs. I mean, you don't have to make a rule about something nobody considers edible to start with, right?
No, but it falls in your bowls.
I know, and we're gonna
Yeah.
talk about that in a minute, yeah.
Yeah, in your
So-
bread.
So when you think through this whole list of instructions, you get all those details, it sounds kind of complicated, but actually, it's very simple. When it comes to land animals, they have to have a fully divided hoof and chew the cud, or you can't eat them. That's it, right? When it comes to fish or marine animals, they have to have fins and scales. Anything else, you can't eat it. When it comes to birds and flying insects, right? Any predator or scavengers, automatically, it seems, off the list. And any insects are off the list unless they have jumping legs. So even though that list is long, if you just take those main points, it would be easy to remember, okay, those are the things we can eat or not. So instead of listing off every single possibility, we just get some examples. But if you remember those principles, you can remember what you're allowed to eat or not.
Can they eat their innards?
No, I don't think so.
The innards of the cow.
You mean like the heart and the liver?
Yeah,
Yeah, as long as you're not bringing it for a sacrifice.
right, because
You
then
can't.
it's the Lord's. But
Right.
if it's your own meal,
Right. You can't eat the fat,
okay,
but there's nothing that says that you can't eat the liver,
okay.
as long as it's not a sacrifice.
There was a thing on Cowboy State Daily, there's a butcher in Chugwater, and people want all that stuff now.
There's a revival in
Yeah,
eating
intestines,
organs
and he said the only thing he has a lot of left over is hearts.
Oh, the hearts are the good part.
I know, I thought so too. Tell them when I have a recipe for
I know, that's true. It's good with pancakes. Okay, moving on.
No, thank you. No, thank you.
pancakes.
What do the following verses say about impurity from animals and how to address it? So, verses 24, first verses 24 and 25.
Don't touch it.
And it's, don't touch it when it's dead, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you do, then
They're
what?
carcasses.
Right.
unclean until evening.
Mhm.
And why is evening
Yeah.
so specific?
Right.
Because that's the beginning of a new day.
Mhm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Now, you notice coming in contact with the carcass of an unclean animal isn't a sin. It just makes you unclean. So the extent of the person's uncleanness depends on if they just touch it or if they actually handle it. Did you notice there's a difference right there, 24 and 25? If you only touch it, you're just unclean until evening. If you handle it, then you're unclean until evening and you have to wash your clothes. The same goes for land animals, and right here, then the text makes a logical addition, well, in the bit that comes next, which is that this includes animals with paws. And so then it, carries on, just specifying more of that in 26 to 28. Any animal that's unclean, if you touch its carcass, it makes you unclean. But any animal that's clean, too, if it's dead and you touch it, it makes you unclean. But this is considered a minor impurity because you don't have to offer any kind of sacrifice. You just wait till evening, wash up, done. But that means you can't pick up a dead mouse in the morning and throw it out, and then go eat the fellowship offering at the tabernacle in the afternoon. Because that connection to death is too close. You have to wait until the next day if you're going to go into the presence of the Lord. So there's things that the Lord's communicating about how far he is from death. And that the people have to keep their distance from that if they want close fellowship with him. Okay, now, what does he say then in 29 to 38? What about rodents, vermin, and lizards?
Yucky.
All of them are unclean. And you're like, whew, good.
No more roadkill.
So,
I've never eaten it, by the way. So you know.
so again, some of these terms are a little obscure. They're difficult to identify, but when it says, well, my translation says anything that moves along the ground. Your translation might say something like swarms or creeps. It's that idea of animals that are like vermin, or animals that can climb up a tree, like those little things that climb up a tree using their front and their back legs both. So you get this idea of like lizards and rats,
Squirrels.
and mice, and squirrels. I know, there's so much,
Raccoon.
there's so much hatred towards squirrels. Okay, so again, anyone who touches them is unclean until evening, and because some of these kinds of animals also invade people's houses, there are some additional instructions about removing the uncleanness that's caused by contact. So, there were different ways of addressing the impurity depending on the object, and he goes through all the details right here in 29 to 38. So, some things could be richly purified by being put, or it might be better to translate that, dipped in water. So for example, things that are made of wood, like an axe handle, or things that are made of cloth, or your shoes, something like that, you can just dip it in water, and that's all it takes. Other things had to be discarded, so any kind of clay object that was a storage pot, ovens were made of clay. So don't, when you read that, don't think about throwing out your Kenmore. It's like a homemade oven, and it's inconvenient to get rid of it, but it's easy to make one again. Easy, I mean, not easy, but you can replace it without a lot of trouble.
That puzzled me because a wooden pot could be washed, but a clay pot couldn't.
And it doesn't explain why, except that some of the writers mention maybe it's because of the way things tend to be absorbed, but I don't know if that's true or not.
Well, I would
But
think
you-
wood would be much more.
Me too.
Absorbent than
Mhm.
clay.
Yeah.
But maybe it depends on what kind of clay pot they're talking about. Maybe if they're just talking about an impervious,
Yeah, if it's porous.
dried in the sun, you know,
Instead of kiln.
pot rather than kiln-fired and kiln-glazed, which I can't imagine they had a lot of kiln-fired, kiln-glazed
I wouldn't think so.
ceramic-type pots. They would be difficult to transport and subject to breakage anyway. So maybe they're just, maybe it's just more like a flower pot type clay, you know.
Well, I'm not gonna argue any of that with you.
And she knows what she's
Well, if you
talking
get
about.
any great insights from God on that, let me know.
Well, I tend to think it's the same thing, that these kinds of pots are just the run-of-the-mill
Yeah.
Yeah,
things that if you break it, no big deal, kind of,
they can make another.
that you can, this is the mean base, this is the, just, the everyday stuff in your kitchen.
Although it still couldn't have been easy to replace or to wash your clothes every time you had to
Yeah.
go. Like that was, I dislike laundry, so I'm kind of sensitive to that. Like every time you become a, you have to, it's not like they had a whole wardrobe and I'll do it next week.
It's enough to make it inconvenient,
Yeah.
Mhm.
but not enough to make it a serious hardship.
And
Okay.
they're desert dwellers, I wouldn't think there'd be
Yeah, it would be a
abundance of water.
difficulty, I would
No.
think.
Right,
It would be precious, the water would be
Yeah.
precious.
and how many sets of clothing did they have, like you said?
And how many quabbles about whose
No,
turn
it'd
it
make
is
them-
to get rid of that dead mouse.
Yeah.
I did it last time.
Make them want to be very careful
Yeah,
that they didn't do that, so they would have to do that.
Maybe you
Right.
could push it with a stick.
Yep.
My kids run around
Particularly if you're,
naked.
if you're planning a pilgrimage to the tabernacle
mhm.
with your family, you have to pay attention before
Yeah.
you go, and I think that's part of what's going on here, is to be aware.
And it's a
Of-
respect thing too,
It
isn't
is.
it?
Yep.
Yeah.
And these things, we'll talk more about this in the next several weeks, but these kinds of physical impurities they're a metaphor that are intended to point people toward the spiritual reality. Well, actually, we'll talk about that at the end too. The last bit that we look at the end, we'll talk about that. But yeah, it's not just that God's just laying out rules that you're like, okay, just makes life harder. No, the rules are intended to make you aware, so that you're living with this daily awareness of what is it that makes you pure or impure. The idea being that you transfer that from physical things to spiritual things, so that you're always aware, more so when it comes to sin. What is it that comes at you from the outside that makes you impure? And are you mindful of that, just day in and day out? Okay, so any food prepared with water from a storage pot where something had fallen into it was also impure. and any type of liquid that was found in the pot was also impure. When I read that, I was like, if I had a dead mouse fall in my soup,
Yeah.
not only would I throw it out, I'd probably take the pot down to the thrift store again. Like, I'm not just mad again. But anyway, yeah. Other things did not become impure at all. So did you notice water sources like springs and cisterns didn't? That's going to be important later, that, you know, running water, fresh water is incontaminatable. And so it's used a lot for purification. Piles of seeds that were yet to be planted, meaning they're dry and they might just be, you know, out in wherever you store your grain. If you find a dead mouse in your grain pile, that doesn't make all the grain unclean. But if it's wet, the idea is, you know, you're already preparing it to be planted, and that it makes it unclean. So these regulations, they underscore the seriousness of impurity. They're still sensitive to the realities of daily life because they allow the Israelites to keep those things that were most time-consuming to produce, or the things that were essential to their survival. Okay, and then what does he add in 39 and 40?
Even clean animals are unclean if they're dead.
Right, if they're already dead. Now, one of the things that's important about the opening bit with the land animals, when it talks about the herd or the flock, is that the edible land animals all include the sacrifices. So all the sacrificable animals are included in what's edible. Now, if you have the carcass of an animal like that, cattle, sheep, goats, pigeons, whatever, even though the animal's ritually clean, a dead body is ritually unclean. So the procedure is the same as that for unclean animals. If someone touches the carcass, they're unclean until evening. If they eat from it or handle it, they're unclean until evening, and they must wash their clothes. And let me just add some clarification right here. If those animals are slaughtered for a sacrifice, that does not cause impurity. If they die a natural death, and you touch it after it's died its death, or if it gets killed by an animal or something, then you touch it, that's what makes it unclean. But when you take it to the tent of meeting and you sacrifice it, that doesn't make you unclean.
So if you slaughtered it for your family for eating, that does not make it unclean?
No.
Okay.
But if you go out and find it dead in the field and decide I don't want to waste the meat, you can eat it, but it just means that you're going to be unclean until you.
Well, isn't that more apt to make you sick? I mean, an animal that's died in the field, are they not more prone to be something that would?
Probably.
Depends on how long they're there.
Yeah.
Yep.
And what, yeah.
And there's a place in Exodus too where the Lord tells the people not to eat stuff that's been torn apart by wild animals.
Right.
And basically it's the idea of he doesn't want his people to act like scavengers.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, he's provided for them and they don't need to do that. But yeah. And the other thing too that is worth mentioning is you notice that touching an unclean animal that's alive does not make you unclean. That's important because you can't eat a camel, but you can ride it. But riding a camel doesn't make you unclean. Riding a donkey doesn't make you unclean. Eating it would make you unclean, but just riding a live animal wouldn't do that to you. But if it's dead and you touch it, then you become unclean. Okay. Then what does he add in 41 and 42?
No snakes.
Woo! Okay, good, right? So, those swarming creatures that were listed before, none of those can be eaten, whether they move on their bellies like snakes, and whether they walk on all fours, whether they have many feet like caterpillars, whatever they are, they're unclean. And then what does he add in 43 to 45?
The bottom line,
Which is?
I am holy, so consecrate yourselves.
Yes, just in case anybody missed it. It's like the Lord emphasizes it every way possible. Don't defile yourselves with those creatures. Don't make yourselves unclean with them. Don't be made unclean by them. Why? Because God, their God is the Lord and He's holy. So they should set themselves apart and be holy because He's holy. And then He repeats it. They are not to make themselves unclean with those creatures, because the Lord's the one who brought them out of Egypt to be their God. And because they belong to him, they should be holy because he's holy. So because they're in covenant relationship with the Lord, they're to avoid defiling themselves in terms of what they eat, because holiness and impurity don't go together. So, I mean, basically the Lord's saying to the Israelites, as an act of worship, set yourselves apart. And one of the ways you do that is by obeying the commands regarding what's edible or inedible and what's clean and unclean. And then the chapter just concludes in 46 and 47 with this couple summary statements. Note the emphasis on the need for God's people to distinguish between the clean and the unclean, and between the edible and the inedible. These are distinctions they're supposed to be making in everyday life, and it sets them apart as belonging to the Lord and being separate from the nations around them. Okay, now, let's just think on the whole purpose of this passage. There are a lot of theories about why this list in Leviticus includes certain animals or not. I mean, there are entire books written on that topic, like why these animals and not those animals. And some people think it's because of hygiene. The problem with that is that most meat's safe to eat if you cook it thoroughly enough. And the New Testament actually does away with all the food laws, which wouldn't make sense if it's hygiene. Why would you not keep it? Other people think that certain animals are excluded because they're used in pagan worship practices. That might be true, but that doesn't explain the inclusion of cattle and goats, which were also used in pagan worship. Now, I would argue that actually none of that matters. It may very well be that the Lord excluded certain animals that were dangerous to eat or associated with paganism, but it doesn't really make a difference to understanding the overall purpose of the dietary rules. I mean, we don't have to know the rationale for not eating horses to know that it's somehow un-American, right? Especially if you live in Wyoming. What matters is that the Lord is using dietary rules to set his people apart for himself. So when the Lord brought the people of Israel to Mount Sinai, they had just spent 400 years living in Egypt. 400 years. And no doubt they were heavily influenced by everything Egyptian. Now it's really important when they come out of Egypt that they don't even think of themselves, and that other people don't think of them as just being a subcategory of Egyptians. They are not Egyptians, they're Israelites. And when the Lord calls them into a covenant relationship with himself, he begins the work of establishing them as a separate nation, a distinct people group, not just racially but culturally. One of the most fundamental, everyday ways to separate them from the nations around them and to give them a distinct identity is with what they eat. By defining for them what's edible and inedible. It's like the Lord just puts a culinary fence around his people. It's a boundary that establishes a particular identity for them. I mean, think about that even subcultures within the U.S. There are certain neighborhoods in big cities where if it's full of Chinese people, they eat certain food. And if it's full of Mexican people, they eat certain food. And if it's full of Italians, that's where you want to go for pizza, right? Because you know those kinds of things define cultures. And they not only define cultures, but they separate people from others. Okay, now, if I was thinking about when you were talking a few weeks ago about eating guinea pigs, right? And having guinea pig skull soup, right? If you had a neighbor who ate guinea pigs a lot, would that put you off going to their house for supper?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now think about that in relation to the Israelites and the place where they're moving. They're moving into the land of Canaan, and it's like the Lord is putting a little culinary fence around the people to separate them out from all the Canaanites, because all these food norms mean it's not going to be easy for them to go have lunch with their Canaanite neighbor. Why does that matter?
No wonder he wanted them to wipe them out and not intermarry.
Mm-hmm.
If you married a woman from there, she'd have all the cooking in her that was unclean.
And is it the animals, the unclean animals, that he's ultimately concerned about?
No.
When you
When
your
you
body.
eat with someone, you form bonds.
Right?
Yes.
You know, sharing a meal is a very strong form of fellowship.
So why would that be a problem?
Well, he's called them to be separate.
Mm-hmm.
he doesn't want them fellowshipping. You fellowship with somebody, pretty soon you start dating them, and then you marry them, and then you have all these children from that marriage, and his word is watered down and forgotten.
So what he's trying to prevent right here, and in all kinds of other ways, is the assimilation of the Israelites into Canaanite culture.
Mhm.
Because if they get assimilated into the Canaanites, what's going to happen?
They'll become Canaanites.
They will, and that's not hypothetical. That's the whole point of the book of Judges. The book of Judges is a description of the people of Israel becoming Canaanites. So that by the time you get to the end of the book of Judges, there's a town in Israel that's indistinguishable from Sodom and Gomorrah. Like, it's horrific, the things that they're doing to their children and to their women.
Mhm.
And God knew that was coming. He put boundaries around them to stop them from being assimilated into Canaanite religion and into Canaanite culture. Because of course, whatever you worship, your morality is going to follow. So here he is setting up boundaries to stop the fellowship between the Israelites and the Canaanites. Not because he's just being picky about who they're neighbors with, but because if they are going to show the people around them the truth of who their God is, they can't just blend into the darkness, which is what they're going to do if they start getting assimilated, and that's exactly what happens. So his whole purpose in this is to, it's not a matter of culinary preference, it's put in terms of what's clean or not, because eating ham is not inherently evil, but following the dietary rules is supposed to be about belonging to him and about being his people. And the Lord just lays it out in black and white, so there's no question about it. So if anyone says, why don't those people eat bacon? The answer isn't that pork is the source of trichinosis or that pigs are used in pagan sacrifices. That might be the case, but the actual answer is that the Lord has set them apart. They are distinct, they belong to the Lord, and these are the rules he has given them. And that's why they don't eat what their neighbors eat, because they belong to the Lord. Just like we could say, why don't we eat horses? Because we're American. Why don't they eat all of these things in the list? Because they belong to the Lord. And they are intended to be distinct. We'll get to this a bit later, but in Leviticus chapter 20, there's actually a couple of verses that spell out the purpose for all of this. So in Leviticus 23, he says, the Lord says, you must not live according to the customs of the nations I am going to drive out before you, because they did all these things I abhorred them, but I said to you, you will possess their land, I will give it to you as an inheritance, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God who has set you apart from the nations. You must therefore make a distinction between clean and unclean animals, between unclean and clean birds. Do not defile yourselves by any animal or bird or anything that moves along the ground. Those which I have set apart as unclean for you. You are to be holy to me, because I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the nations to be my own. There's the purpose of the clean laws. It's to separate the people of Israel from the nations around them. And by the way, this is a side note, but it's significant. The definition of what's edible is not unrelated to the definition of what's sacrificable. So as with food, so with sacrifices, it's the Lord who determines for his people what's sacrificable or not. Now, some of the sacrifices in Israel are the same as in other nations, but some of them are different. And in the same way that it wouldn't even occur to us to eat a cat, it wouldn't occur to someone in the ancient Near East to sacrifice a cat, because there was no culture anywhere in the ancient Near East where cats were a viable sacrifice. Now here's the thing, in the same way that cats were not sacrificable, the Lord said that children were not sacrificable. Now that was different from the Canaanite nations because they did sacrifice children. So when you get to, for example, Judges 11 and the story of Jephthah sacrificing his daughter. Some people think he didn't actually sacrifice her. I do. I think he did it. And the thing is, the fact, it should never have occurred to him to sacrifice her. Now, he says something really stupid in that story. He's like, okay, Lord, you give me victory, whatever walks out of my front door first, I'll sacrifice it.
Mhm.
What do you think would have happened if a frog had come out? Would he have sacrificed it?
No.
No, because frogs aren't sacrificable. It wouldn't have even occurred to him to do that. It should not have occurred to him to sacrifice his daughter. Because children are no more sacrificable to the Lord than frogs are. Why did it occur to him?
Because he's been around it, maybe.
Yeah.
Because he's being assimilated into the culture of the Canaanites. Because now he's starting to take his understanding about the Lord, not from the Lord's word, but from the culture and the worship practices of the nations around him. So you watch a judge who should know better, but he doesn't because he's getting all his knowledge about the Lord from what his neighbors do. And you end up not only eating what you shouldn't, but you end up sacrificing what you shouldn't.
What about Abraham and Isaac then?
What about
Abraham was ready to sacrifice Isaac.
But who told him to do it?
The Lord.
See, I think that's the point where the Lord steps in and says, the kind of sacrifice that would have been normal in his culture, the Lord stops it for a purpose. He takes the normal sacrifice and then says, that's not how I'm going to do it. Why not? Because there is a son coming who's going to be the ultimate sacrifice, and it's not Isaac.
Okay.
So children don't get sacrificed anywhere in worship to the Lord because it's the Son of God who's going to get sacrificed instead.
He did stop it, yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, now, I'm actually not going to read Mark 7:18 to 23. I think it's probably familiar to you, but this is the passage where Jesus is having this conversation with the Pharisees because they're getting a little worked up that the disciples are not washing their hands, doing not hygiene, but like ritual washing before they eat. And so they put up a fuss with Jesus, and Jesus then says, well, do you remember what Jesus says to them?
It's not what goes in your mouth, it's what comes out.
Out of your heart, right?
Mhm.
Because then he lists off all of these different sins. Those are the things that make you unclean. And in that passage, Mark adds, in saying that, Jesus declared all foods clean. Now, why do you think that Jesus does that? Why does Jesus declare all the foods clean?
Because he's sacrificed.
He's the ultimate sacrifice.
Yeah, the sacrifice is done,
Mm-hmm.
or will be.
Mhm.
So what is it that makes us pure?
The blood of Jesus Christ.
Right, so it's not what you eat.
Mhm.
How do you become pure? It's through the work of the Spirit,
Right.
right? Now, here's the thing. If you maintain the food laws, what's the problem with that?
Then you're not trusting the sacrifice.
Mhm.
You're not putting your trust in Jesus' work.
And then, as you go through the book of Acts, then what's the problem? If the purpose of the food laws in the Old Testament was to separate the Israelites from their neighbors, from the Gentiles, if you maintain the food laws after Jesus, what's the consequence of that?
He
Can't
tells
love
us,
your neighbor.
he
You
tells
can't love
us
your
to go
neighbor.
out into the world, and you can't go out into the world and be separate at the same time.
You can, but not physically,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So now it's a spiritual separation. It's not a physical one. So there's no fellowship between Jews and Gentiles if the Lord doesn't bring down these food laws. That doesn't make them irrelevant. It just means it's pointing to a bigger spiritual reality, which is we are in the world but not of it, right? We are intended to live wherever in the world and to spread the gospel. But we are warned not to be assimilated to the world, right? Jesus says you still have to be light, you still have to be salt. If you get assimilated, you just become the darkness.
Right.
Mhm.
And then what? But the separation is not a physical one, it's a spiritual one. And it's done by the work of the Spirit on the other side of the cross. So, all these food laws, when we think about certain laws that we follow or we don't in Leviticus, we're going to talk more about this as we continue through the next few chapters, but here's something to think on is we're not cherry picking which laws we follow and which ones we don't when we say, okay, adultery is still contrary to what God wants, but eating ham is fine. There's actually a logical reason why we say eating ham is fine. because Jesus brought down those restrictions in order for the gospel to spread, in order for there to be fellowship between Jews and Gentiles, and in order to emphasize the separation ultimately is not about what goes into your mouth. It's a spiritual separation that is about your character. And it's a character that's worked in you by the power of the Spirit. We'll keep talking about that, as we keep going. So let me just read a last quote for you. Just as God had separated Israel from among the peoples, so Israel was to distinguish between clean and unclean animals in relation to what they ate. Every meal served as a reminder of God's choosing of Israel out of the nations, but also of Israel's call to keep themselves separate from the uncleanness of those nations in order to be a holy people. The food laws became a sign of Israel's identity and calling, a wall of separation between Israel and the nations. Israel had been chosen by God and cleansed and possessed with his dwelling in their midst, fullness of life, and the Gentiles were still exiled from the divine presence, unclean and in the realm of death. When Jesus' atonement and the gift of the Spirit yield true cleansing for both Jew and Gentile by faith, therefore, the food laws which serve to symbolize and foster the distinction between them those are done away with. Yeah, because now it's about the Spirit. Now, that doesn't mean none of that's relevant to us, because Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:31, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God, right? So we're still mindful about being holy, but holiness is not about whether we eat this kind of meat or that kind of meat. It's about things to do with our character and the character of Christ worked out in us. Okay. Do you have comments? Anything you want to add?
I don't know, back in verse 10. No, that's not the verse. Verse 11 maybe. New King James uses the term abomination. You, in your NIV reading, it was detestable, and it's such a strong word that when you eat these things, these certain things are an abomination. To me, that's like there's no returning from.
Which is maybe why when God wanted to bring down the barrier between Jews and Gentiles, what did he have to do to convince Peter? He had to give him a vision, right?
Yeah.
Like Peter had to see it in living color to really be convinced. Okay, I need to dispense with calling these things unclean, because that means I can't. If I keep calling all those foods unclean, I'm going to keep calling the Gentiles unclean.
It would have been difficult for those men in those days
Yes,
to
it would.
completely
Yeah.
disregard all the rules that they grew up with,
Yep.
dietary rules.
Yep. Which is maybe why you see Peter struggle with it even after the vision in Acts. He still has problems not reverting back to the food laws because it's so very much ingrained into them.
Sometimes I feel like us going to Finland and starting to eat horse.
Yeah,
I ate alligator in February,
did you?
and that crawls on the ground.
It's okay,
And
you're
how
the
was
grace,
it?
not under law.
And how was it? Tastes like chicken.
It wasn't bad. It just.
I'll bet it's
tasted like
greasier
chicken.
than chicken.
It was prepared really well. I've had it where it's rubbery before in Florida, but it was prepared very well at a seafood restaurant, so.
Oh, interesting.
Was it breaded and fried, or was it more grilled?
It was more grilled with vegetables and onions and stuff.
And it didn't taste better than tofu.
Yeah.
It didn't taste like chicken though, huh?
It did, kind of, just like chicken breast is what it tasted like. Bear is kind of gross, though.
I like bear. I haven't had it for a